Hey, welcome to Season 6 of the Two Text Podcast. I'm here with my co-host David Harvey, and my name is John Andrews.
Yeah.
So this is a podcast of two friends from two different countries meeting every 2 weeks to talk about the Bible. Each week we pick one text to talk about, which invariably leads to us talking about two texts and often many more. Now this season we're exploring Jesus' I am sayings in John's Gospel and how they draw us into a bigger vision of who Jesus is.
Well, John chapter 10, just to clarify, I'm saying to you, John, talking about John's Gospel chapter 10.
Too many Johns.
It's a bit of a 2-for-1 deal, isn't it? That you actually get the I am the gate, and you also get I am the good shepherd. So one chapter, two I am sayings all at once. Which is, as we said last time, sometimes we almost lose I am the gate because the good shepherd is such a famous text for us. But this week we're going to continue the conversation from gate to shepherd, aren't we?
Indeed we are. And I think it's a good observation that those two, they almost run together. And in fact, as we move on to the shepherd conversation, we're still in the same context that we talked about in Gate. So it sort of strengthens the argument that Jesus is definitely speaking to and about and around the spiritual leadership of his day. So it really, this does crank it up a little bit as we move into this next I am. I think it's number 4, isn't it, in our list? We've done bread, light, gate, and now we're on to the shepherd. So yeah.
And so there is a little bit of homework almost needed. If you've been listening to the podcast in order, you've done the homework. But I think it's worth, as you come to read just now, it's worth remembering we've had the healing of the man who is born blind, which has led to this extended conversation, as you said, with religious community and the religious leaders, which has led to the I am the gate. And I am the good shepherd is all part of the same run of a story. So we're not going to keep rereading the whole story, but it's if this was a Netflix show, it would be like previously on.
Yes.
you would have the man born blind, the I am the gate, and then John 10 verse 11 onwards, wouldn't you?
Indeed we would. And in fact, my wife has been watching reruns of 24. So people of a certain age listening to the podcast might still remember how groundbreaking 24 was with Keith Sunderland as Jack, and it's quite amazing. We watched those years ago, and I still my first sort of thing that I remember about it is previously on 24, and it was such a novel thing. So yeah, we have to keep reminding ourselves there is a previously here, which will definitely help us as we lean into the next bit.
And so you're going to read John chapter 10, verse 11 onwards for us, aren't you?
I am. I have the privilege of reading this. So we're going to jump in verse 11, John chapter 10, and we'll go down to around about verse 21. And I'm reading from the NIV version, and it says this is Jesus' words: I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own account. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. The Jewish authorities who heard these words were again divided. Many of them said, he is demon-possessed and raving mad. Why listen to him? But others said, these are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?
And that little reminder there reminds us that, this whole story has happened from John chapter 9. This
Absolutely. It's all running. Yeah.
I was struck by something that we've said quite a few times. It really comes into sharp relief in the passage you just read, that the I am statements are contrasting statements. They are statements about things you thought were the good shepherd. Now turns out that Jesus is the good shepherd. And this statement, you really do get the either ors, which can make us a little uncomfortable sometimes. But you do get this painting of Jesus is the good shepherd. But now here is a picture of what the opposite of the good shepherd looks like. And what's to me quite stunning, just as an initial reaction, is that the wolf is not the opposite of the good shepherd.
No.
That we would naturally sort of drum it. There's the shepherd who's looking after the sheep, and then there's the wolf that's trying to kill the sheep. Because that was the image that we almost had last time from the hired hand. So the hired hand versus the thief that's coming to destroy. But now you get this extra nuance that comes out that the good shepherd, at first glance, might not be distinguishable from the hired hand. They're both caring for the sheep. They're both present to the sheep. They're both actually in position in order to protect from the wolf and the thief and the destroyer. And it's only when those moments actually come that the contrast becomes. So it's like the same metaphor of sheep, but by transitioning it from gate and thief to now shepherd and hired hand, it's a very much more complex analysis that's required by Jesus here, which I think is why the religious community get even more uncomfortable with it.
I think so. No, I think that's spot on. And I think you're seeing the contrast here between the good shepherd and the hired hand. And by implication, remember the flow of the context. Our listeners, if they've been tracking with us, will know this, but just in case you're jumping in, but right at the end of chapter 9, it's really the religious community that are in conflict with Jesus now over this miracle. So it's they that are agitated by this miracle. They're agitated by the lack of cooperation from the man who has been healed. And in fact, he seems to be further exposing their own inadequacy around this issue. And then, of course, that explodes because as we end with chapter 9, we get this sort of, are we blind too, the religious leaders say? And Jesus sort of pushes that back at them. Well, if you are blind, then actually this isn't held to your account. But if you're claiming you can see, then this is held to your account. So, and then we launch into chapter 10. So I think the hired hand here absolutely leans towards the religious leaders of his day. He's saying, to sort of pick up your idea, if people were listening to this, it would be like, on the surface of it, these leaders and myself look the same. But when the pressure's put on, when the wolf comes, you're going to see the difference. And because they are motivated by one thing, I am motivated by another. They are motivated by, in the context of the hired hand, they're motivated by money they're earning. I'm motivated by ownership. I own these sheep. These are my sheep, and therefore I will do whatever I can to save them. And so he's definitely now creating if it was nuanced in the gate conversation, although I think it's more than that, but if it's nuanced there, it's definitely explicit here in terms of the contrast between the hired hand and the good shepherd, and the contrast between Jesus and the religious leaders who claim to be good shepherds of the people is now being absolutely put out there in as a dynamic contrast, I think.
It's interesting to me, John, that this image and picture of the good shepherd versus the hired hand is an image that's worked out in the actual happening of it. I realize at some point we'll almost definitely talk about Psalm 23 in this conversation, but it's the same sort of feel to me, that the knowing of the shepherding hand comes in the experience, not in like you. Maybe I'm trying to say it like this: looking at a good shepherd, looking at the hired hand, very hard to tell the difference.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm not to be too on the nose with it, but you think the word shepherd is where we also get the word pastor from. This sense of the caring appearance. Somebody can look like a pastor, they can look like a shepherd, they can look like a parent, but then how they behave when things are difficult, how they behave when things get tough, this is really where you decide who is this person. And I think this is a really fascinating piece. And I'm tempted, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, that some level it is being framed by Psalm 23, that Jesus is saying, I am the good shepherd, and you'll know that once you see things happen. And as things start happening, and I can't help but think what happens in Jesus' life when things get difficult is everybody else runs away and he remains. It's really interesting language, isn't it?
It is. It's very dynamic, and I think you're seeing the contrast. For me, it's almost a contrast between a positional idea and a relational idea. So you've got in the hired hand and the shepherd something that positionally looks very similar. They're both sort of looking after the sheep on paper, and from a distance or from a perspective. Their position is similar, but of course, the difference, as you said, is experiential. It's relational. It's how the hired hand behaves towards the sheep at crucial moments, and it's how the good shepherd behaves towards the sheep. So we have the contrast of the hired hand running away, whereas as I was reading it, you just struck again, just dynamically, by the fact that on at least 4 occasions in the reading that I gave, Jesus talks directly or slightly sideways on laying down his life for the sheep. So verse 11, he lays down his life. Verse 15, verse 17, and in verse 18, there's a repeat of the idea. I lay it down on my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down. So if you include the 2 references in verse 18, you've got 5 references to laying his life down for the sheep. Yeah. In contrast to the one thing the hired hand does, which is scarper and run away.
Yes.
So I think you're absolutely right. I think there's an experiential. I like the thought of one is positional, one's relational. At the positional level, they look similar. It's at the relational level and therefore the behavioral level that they are completely different and dynamically different. And again, if we set that back in the context of the moment of John 9 and 10, Jesus is sort of saying, I think in some ways, positionally, the Pharisees look similar to me, but actually the behavior is going to be different because of the way they relate to the people and the way they see the people. So it's really striking, David, that, there would have been within the Pharisaic community almost a separation culture, and this idea that the common people or the people of the land, the Am Haaretz, were not to be associated with. And yet they are the very people that Jesus associates with. And you get this sort of distinctiveness that one spiritual leader is doing it out of a sense of duty, but is distanced from the sheep. And yet the other one is doing it out of a sense of love and is completely immersed in the sheep and smells like sheep and loves the sheep and 5 times declares, I'm prepared to die for the sheep. It is quite a contrast.
It's interesting as well. I think about, as you were saying that, I was drawn to Paul's comments in 1 Corinthians 4, when he says, even if you had 10,000 guardians in Christ, you do not have many fathers. But in Christ Jesus, I became your father through the gospel. You get the same sort of idea picking up on this, that a guardian versus a father, any normal run-of-the-mill day could look quite similar. You watch a child out with their babysitter versus a child out with their parent. If everything's good and well, you might not be able to tell the difference. Right? But when things go wrong, this is when you're going to tell the difference. And I'm fascinated by that understanding almost that Like things are going to go wrong. Like I have received this command from my Father to lay down my life. That's really what Jesus is saying here. So he's going into this as the good shepherd. He's not unaware that this is requiring, I mean, like you said, it's the first thing he says about the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. It's quite a remarkable observation that Jesus is under no qualms that being this shepherd is going to cost him his life, but he will remain to the end on that. I think about later in John's gospel, he says, I've lost none that you gave to me. Like these themes are hugely interreacting, not only just what's happened in John 9, but actually an image of Jesus throughout the whole gospel that he has come to lay his life down.
Yeah, superb. And I think in that language of laying your life down, we're seeing then, I think, two incredible ideas tucked into that is that the nature of this shepherd, right? So this is not just a shepherd who wants to walk around the fields and lead his sheep, but this is a shepherd literally prepared to put his life on the line for these sheep. And again, you have there an unmissable Davidic echo. I mean, David himself is the one who speaks when he goes to Saul to fight Goliath. He says, I have fought the lion and the bear.
Yes.
Now, I mean, you've really got to love your sheep to be putting your life on the line against a lion and a bear. Because, I've seen both of those creatures, some in the wild and some in sort of captivity, like zoos or safe safari settings. And they are ferocious and dangerous and, dynamic creatures. And David said, I pursued them, I destroyed them, I defended my sheep against them. So when Jesus says, I lay my life down for the sheep, I think you're getting an unmissable Davidic nuance there. And I think the audience would hear that. And knowing that David was not just a great king, but he was identified also as a leader shepherd. On more than one occasion, he's named in that way. And then I think the other idea, David, for me, is the value of the sheep. Like, that's the other thing that strikes me. When the first thing the Good Shepherd says about himself is that he's prepared to lay down his life for the sheep, these two things strike me. Number one, what an incredible shepherd. This is saying something about him. Number two, it's saying also something about how he values the sheep. That actually these sheep are valuable to him, important to him.
Yes.
That they are... he owns them, and therefore, you could push the argument there's a commercial value, but of course, we're thinking beyond commercial. He's the intrinsic value of the sheep is what he's laying down his life for, and I'm struck by that, and I think that's the contrast to the religious leaders of his day, and even an echo to some of the religious leaders that are referenced in the Tanakh in the Hebrew Bible. There's a similar contrast there. So I think we're already picking up the value of the sheep and the character of the shepherd, as well as now leaning into dynamic Tanakh, Hebrew Bible, Old Testament nuances that are wrapped up in these particular statements.
John, there's a story that we tell in Canada. It's just a joke or whatever, but people often, it comes up whenever you're on a hike, and there's two men on a hike one day in the Rocky Mountains, and they come round a corner in the trail, and there's a bear there, and the bear is angry, and it rears up, and the one man immediately drops his backpack on the ground, kicks off his hiking boots, and starts putting on a pair of running shoes. And his friend says to him, he says, "Man, what are you doing? You can't outrun a bear." He says, "Yeah, I don't need to outrun a bear. I just need to outrun you." and if you'll forgive the terrible joke, there's a level of which that's exactly the opposite of what's happening here.
Exactly.
And having been in the mountains and bumped into bears, there's a deep natural reaction to want to flee. And here Jesus is pushing beyond that natural reaction to say that in between, me and the wolf, as David says, to King Saul, between the sheep and the bear is me. But then it strikes me, John, just to push a little further beyond the terrible joke, Notice verse 16. I have other sheep that do not belong
Yeah.
to this fold. I must
Yeah.
bring them also, and they will listen to my voice.
Mm.
And I was thinking about how difficult it is for us as humans to conceptualize, that Jesus is now pushing beyond even the spectrum of what we know, that there are those who listen to his voice that are elsewhere, and he's laying down his life for them as well, and that we're not getting to define the good shepherd, his flock, the people that he's willing to lay his life down for, are just simply those who have listened to his voice. So it could be any number of people he's dying for, which of course we know is true from the gospel. But to think about that, in the perspective of what it means to be Christian, of what it means to be in the kingdom of God. And I was reading this piece just the other day there that a friend sent through to me, and it was somebody who was preaching off the back of a text in John's gospel, actually around John 17, and the text of those who basically have been given to Jesus by God, and the glory that Jesus has. And let me just read this for you. It struck me as really quite powerful. The preacher says this: you don't need less of the church to have more of the kingdom. You don't need less sacrament to have more word. You don't need to have less material to have more that's spiritual. With Christ before us, we see you don't need to have less of humanity to have more of God. So Christians should be wary of the zero-sum game. We should beware of an assumption that more of this implies less of that. Be wary of any suggestion that competition rules the day. And I was thinking about that as you were talking just then, that Jesus is saying to them, like, not only am I the good shepherd, you don't know everybody that's in this flock. You don't know everybody that I'm dying for. And so by Jesus being our shepherd, doesn't by implication mean he's not their shepherd.
Yeah.
Doesn't by implication mean he's laying down his life for me, but not for them. And I mean, and that's a really powerful, I think, line in the middle of this text here, that I'm laying down my life for the sheep, Jesus says. But it's almost as if he's saying, but don't over-define that as, oh, I'm laying my life down just for you. Bear in mind that this is all happening on the back of the Pharisees kicking a man out of the synagogue. So somebody's been excluded. We're the sheep, you're the goats. And Jesus is saying, no, you are the sheep. Absolutely, you are the sheep. But don't think you're all the sheep. Yeah. And I think that sense of just being aware of the fact that God doesn't have a zero-sum game. And that you and I grew up in backgrounds where we look to other denominations with some suspicion sometimes. Like, well, they're not proper Christians. And there's this lesson from Jesus of saying to us, the good shepherd defines who the sheep are. And sometimes we're going to meet people who are shepherded by Jesus that we didn't know were shepherded by Jesus. And so there's this real invitation for us to see that in the kingdom of God, Jesus' sheep being bigger than we realized doesn't diminish his willingness to lay his life down for us. That Jesus is not limited.
So true, so true. And I think within all of that, David, there is a gorgeous Isaiah echo. Isaiah 56, which has popped up and pops up again in the ministry of Jesus. But Isaiah 56 points to this. In verse 8, it literally says, the sovereign Lord declares, he who gathers the exiles. Now, you could also translate that something like outcast, but he who gathers the exiles of Israel, I will gather still others to them, besides those already gathered. Right? Now, the reason that Isaiah 56 verse 8 is important, and we touched on this 1,000,000 years ago when we dealt with the Ethiopian eunuch. So for those that are really serious to text podcast fans, they may remember that we lent into Isaiah 56 when speaking of that eunuch, because eunuchs are specifically referenced in that gorgeous Isaiah passage. And it says something like this. So verse 3, let no foreigner who is bound to the Lord say, the Lord will surely exclude me from his people. And let no eunuch complain, I am only a dry tree. To the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, he goes on to say, who choose what pleases me and hold fast to my covenant, to them I will give within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name better than sons and daughters. And he goes on to say this, and foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it and who hold fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. And of course, it goes on to talk about their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all the nations. And of course, Jesus quotes that when he cleans out the temple. So the point that you're making about the other sheep, I don't even think that's like Jesus, just being missionally inclusive. I think this is Jesus riffing directly off Isaiah. I think this is Jesus leaning into that. And I think his audience, again, remember these amazing Pharisees who would have known the Tanakh inside out, could not have heard the reference to other besides you, and not hear the Isaiah reference. I think they're hearing Jesus is deliberately leaning into this magnificent Isaiah moment where others other than us are going to be drawn in to the plan of Messiah and to the plan of the kingdom of God as reference to the scriptures. And of course, it even goes on to say in Psalm 56 or Isaiah 56.
Well, I was going to actually push you on this because if you keep reading beyond the other side of what you were saying, I was going to ask you the question. So I'll jump in and ask it and then keep saying this. But do you think the Pharisees even hear potentially the implied critique that happens in Isaiah 56, verse 9 onwards? Because it really, in the context that you've set up, if that's in their minds, surely they hear this critique.
Absolutely. 100%. 100%. So in my Bible, you have a little heading between verses 8 and 9, and there's a little break. But if you read on, come all you beasts of the field, come and devour all you beasts of the forest. Israel's watchmen are blind. Now the watchmen are synonymous, euphemistic phrases for leadership. Ezekiel leans into this idea. So Israel's watchmen are blind. They all lack knowledge. They are mute dogs. They cannot bark. They lie around and dream. They love to sleep. They are dogs with mighty appetites. They never have enough. And then it's just, look at this phrase. They are shepherds who lack understanding. They all turn to their own way and they seek their own gain. Come, each one cries, let us get wine, let us drink our fill of beer, and tomorrow we will be like today or even far better. So again, there's the hired hand dynamic. So there's shepherds who lack understanding and they seek their own gain. That's exactly the language of the hired hand. The hired hand seeks his own gain. Once under pressure, and that gain is going to be minimized because he could potentially lose an arm or a hand or be severely injured by a bear or a wolf or a lion. Well, his true colors get shown. But in contrast to that, of course, the good shepherd is saying, I'll take the lion and the bear and the wolf on. And if the Pharisees didn't understand the implied criticism of them, by even the other reference, and I think there's other prophetic references that which we'll probably lean into next podcast. But if they are missing this, then they don't know Isaiah. I think if they know Isaiah, they're going, oh, hold on a minute. We've heard this before. And the other doesn't just point to the inbringing of the eunuch and the Gentiles and the foreigners, but there's an implication that actually the Lord is unhappy with the state of his shepherds and the watchmen over Israel. So I think there's a double whammy happening when Jesus uses the term other and hired hand. I think Isaiah 56 rocks that completely, and I think Jesus is riffing off it.
Yeah, that's powerful, John. That's really powerful. So you get this sense of Jesus now is drawing himself into a deep historic critique of what happens when people basically lose. I mean, the shepherds who do not know the shepherds who have no understanding is quite a, in John's language, quite a stunning idea, isn't it? The sense of being drawn to, I mean, hear me well when I say this, that idea of Isaiah as the shepherds who have no understanding coming in here in John 10 off the back of a man who cannot see but is able to hear could add layers to what's going on here. That if we're to hear that Jesus is actually bringing a biblical critique, to your point, he's not just saying, hey, by the way, here's this idea of a shepherd that I've made up the metaphor for that you'll understand, but he's actually leveraging a biblical critique of religious authorities that are not being good shepherds off the back of a man who, think about what they say, do you dare to lecture us, they say to the blind man. Right? And yet here Jesus is alluding to a text where they are called shepherds without understanding.
So that's it for this episode. Now, we know there's always more to explore, and we encourage you to dive into the text and do that. If you like this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you rated it, reviewed, or shared it. We also appreciate all our listeners who financially support the show, sharing the weight of producing the podcast. If you'd like to support us, visit twotext.com. But that's all for now. So until next time, from David and I, it's goodbye.